Thanks, Sheila, for the nice introduction. Those of you who are taking race and ethnicity will find a lot of commonality between the presentation that we got in President Paswani's class and my presentation today. We call it the History of Ethnic Diversity in McHenry County. It's a presentation that grows out of one that I did twice before, but in a little bit different venue for a little bit different purpose. I was invited in 2015 to do a presentation called Monitoring Your Racial Awareness for the Leadership McHenry County Group, which is sort of a CEOs from local businesses and academic people from around the county and so forth. So it was kind of it wasn't a student audience. They liked it and invited me back 3 years later. So I basically took this and I'm going to skew it a little bit more because it's Black History Month toward the African American experience. But as I told my students for many, again and again and again for years, you can't understand the story of any one group unless you understand the context, and that involves the story of other groups. And you also have to be paying attention to what's going on in the nation and the world. And so we'll bring all of that to bear in this presentation. Sometimes we'll zoom in on McHenry County, sometimes we'll zoom in on the African American experiences, but we'll also sometimes step back from time to time and look at the big picture. One of the reasons I'm happy to be doing this presentation is that I get to reuse my opening joke, which is, we're talking about ethnic diversity in McHenry County. I know what you're thinking. This isn't going to take very long. But actually, what these patterns that may seem to be natural are not natural at all. And it took a heap of doing to achieve the low level of ethnic and racial diversity that we have in McHenry County. It's true that the county is now, has been, and probably will continue to be less diverse than the nation as a whole, certainly. But social, economic, political, even geographical forces affect the racial and ethnic composition of any place. And that's true here too. So what I will do in this presentation, I'll give a basic sketch of some of these social forces. I'll start with an overview of where we are today, look at some census data. It's getting old, we're all excited in sociology because we're going to get a fresh new census this year, I hope, unless the Russians hack into it or something. But, and then we'll step into the Wayback Machine to explore how we got there, and then I'll close with some challenges, some thoughts on the challenges we face in regard to racial and ethnic diversity in general, and in McHenry County in particular. But before we get going, because it's a student audience, I wanted to not take for granted this distinction. I'm used to it, sociologists are used to it, but normal, as opposed to normal people, these days in the social sciences, when we use the word race, what we're really basically talking about is classifying people into groups based on how their bodies look. This can focus on skin color, hair, eyes, lips, noses, and so forth. And of course, those are biological characteristics, right? You know, you look at a baby, oh, she's got her mother's eyes. But what's interesting about race, to social scientists at least, is that we may think of race as a biological phenomenon, but what's interesting about race is social, not biological, because the same package of bodily features that gets put in one box, in one place, at one time, could be put in a completely different box, in a different place, at a different time. And if that's true, then there's something really important about race that isn't biological at all. Another source of maybe confusion about the word is that it's an old term, and it was used in the past to describe groups that we would call ethnic groups today. But people talked about the British race, or the French race, or the Nordic race, or the Mediterranean race, and they meant in the biological sense. And sometimes that word gets used in ways like that today.
ethnicity is from a Greek word, ethnos, or people, introduced as a word in the English language not until the middle of the 20th century as a term for social scientists to use. And what it basically boils down to is classifying people into, who are your people? Who do you identify with? And it's usually based on culture, so language, religion, even food preferences, do you eat with a fork or chopsticks? Often on nationality, where are your people from? And in the United States, because we're a multi-ethnic country of immigrants or people descended from immigrants, mostly, it often is linked to immigrant history. What boat did your people get off of and from where? So when we talk about these terms, I just want to take just a moment to understand that. We're going to deal with both of these phenomena in this presentation. I thought about adding racial and ethnic inequality to the title of the presentation, but it wouldn't have fit on a nice PowerPoint slide. Okay, so let's look at the most recent census data, which is actually, these are estimates. The Census Bureau takes the last actual census, the actual last enumeration of the population, and then it applies various magical tricks to project, to estimate what it is currently. So in 2016, there were about 307,000 people in McHenry County. 93.5% of those people, and I think you can see that fairly well, are white alone. And the census asks you, you classify yourself. People who identify as entirely African American or black, at the same time, 1.6% of the population. That's much lower than the state of Illinois and lower than the nation as a whole. The black population's been about 12% of the US population for a long time. A very negligible proportion of people who identify as Native American or Alaskan Native. 2.9% identify Asian. That includes a very wide range of ethnic national origins, right? All the way, Asia is a very big place. 1% of the population, you can do the arithmetic, but I'm not going to, identify as Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. One interesting thing that's happening, and I'll talk about this a little bit toward the end, is people beginning to identify as multiracial. There have always been multiracial people, but for people to claim as their identity being multiracial, at least as far as we know, there aren't that many people who identify as two or more races. 12, almost 13% of the population Hispanic or Latino or Latinx, which is the new, all the cool kids use that term now to talk about people of Latin American ancestry. That's a big change in the years that I've lived in McHenry County, and we'll address that again because we understand the context as when we talk about the African American experience as well. And then, bottom line, 81.5% of the population consider themselves white alone. All right, so why is our country so much less, our county, so much less African American than the state and the nation? We're going to step into the Wayback Machine, and it dawned on me as I was putting this PowerPoint together. People may not know what the Wayback Machine was. This is Mr. Peabody and his boy Sherman. It was a feature on the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon back in the late 50s and early 60s. And they would travel through time. It was pretty funny stuff. If you've ever watched Rocky and Bullwinkle, you know that that's where a lot of our modern humor comes from. Well, we'll get to Mr. Lowen in a minute. That was a spasm here. We're not going back very far in the Wayback Machine. Illinois was admitted to the Union in 1818. And that was that period of time, over half a century, that we as a nation kind of kicked the slavery can down the road, let somebody else take care of it in the future. When we would admit a new state, we would admit them in pairs. There'd be a free state and a slave state. Well, Mississippi had just been admitted as a slave state. Illinois was then admitted as a free state. They had to hit a population minimum for a territory to become a state. I did a little research into that. I was absent that day in American history class. But in this part of the state, European settlement really didn't start until the 1830s, after the Potawatomi were invited to leave. Well, so what? Well, it makes three interesting consequences when we're talking about the ethnic and racial history of McHenry County. First, there's no real European colonial legacy here. I mean, it's true that at different times in the past, this territory was claimed by Spain. Sometimes it was claimed by France. Sometimes it was claimed by England, but it didn't really make any difference for, when the voyageurs came through, they didn't stay. Our demographic history isn't shaped by the policies of European empires. That would be different if you were talking about Louisiana or New York or many other parts of the country. So no European colonial legacy. Two, because Illinois was admitted as a free state, we never had plantation slavery, and after the emancipation of the slaves, we didn't have a large emancipated population. In fact, when Illinois was first admitted to the Union, free people of color, people who were of African ancestry but were not enslaved, were not allowed to come into the state. This was not enforced. Some states enforced it, some didn't, but there was never a large population of freed people, either people who were free when they came here or people who were emancipated. The last point is Illinois was never part of Mexico. A lot of the United States used to be Mexico. When I would teach, I would quote there's a song by Los Tigres del Norte. That's a kind of a norteño band, and their song is called Somos Más Americanos, and they don't say it, but it's Más Americanos como usted. We're more American than you because we're, our indigenous heritage goes back to the, and et cetera. But they have a line in there that it translates, I didn't cross the border crossed me. So the Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, California, a lot of America used to be part, not just of the Spanish Empire, but of an independent nation. And that has all sorts of interesting consequences for their social and demographic and racial histories. We don't have that in Illinois. Illinois was conquered directly from the indigenous nations and not from another entity of European design. So who did come to McHenry County after the Potawatomi left? Well, in the 19th century, there was just slow migration into this part of the country, mostly by people of English and Scotch-Irish descent, mostly people who had been born in the United States. A lot of people came from upstate New York for some reason. But there was a significant foreign-born population, largely from the Scandinavian countries and from Germany and from Ireland. The big southern and eastern European migration period hadn't started at that time. In 1860, the census counted 22,000 people in the county. 40 years later, 1900, there were only 30,000 people here, so less than the current population even of Crystal Lake. But there's another story here, and I think we have to acknowledge this to understand what happened in the last part of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. And that's where we borrow from the work of James W. Lowen, who wrote a book that I reread for this presentation called Sundown Towns, a hidden dimension of American racism. Well, what's a sundown town? Well, it's a town where it's understood either informally or in some cases by signs or by a siren that goes off that if you're black, you better be out of this town by sunset or something bad is going to happen to you. Now, this was not a deep Southern phenomenon. In the Deep South, they needed black people. You know, who's going to work in the white people houses, you know, and who's going to pick cotton and so forth. So the African American population was, you know, a very important labor force. No, it was places like Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and some of the border states too, you know, the Kentucky, Tennessee, and so forth. But if you're going to all this trouble to keep black people out, there must be black people around. And that's the thing that Lowen has demonstrated, looking at census data, that after the Civil War, African Americans migrated in much smaller numbers than in the so-called Great Migration in the 20th century. But it was, you know, these were people who had been emancipated to pretty much everywhere else in what was then the United States. Minnesota, Wisconsin. There were very few counties in the U.S. that had no African Americans at all. But beginning toward the end of the century, a pattern emerged that Lowen has called the Great Retreat, that in various ways, some violent, the small, scattered African American population was encouraged to depart these small towns and rural areas and go to cities in the same, usually in the same state, where there was a black population. So it's the so-called ghetto, the African American neighborhoods, were at least in part created by expelling African Americans from rural areas. So I think my next slide, now we're going to zero in on McHenry County. It's surprising, let's say it was more difficult than I was willing to go to the trouble to do, to get all of the census data broken down for McHenry County in particular. I could have added up all the census tracts, but I'm retired. So, but this gives us the overall picture. We do know about the percent black, and I got some of that information from Lowen's website. If you look in 1890, well, there were 20,114 white people in the county. 39 of those people were black. 20 years later, there were 13,000 more white people, 10 fewer blacks. Now these are very small numbers, right? But my point is that the proportion of people in McHenry County who were black went down from 1890 to 1970. And most of that decline happened before 1950. And that's the pattern that Lowen is alluding to. Now, we see since 2000 a large percentage increase. You know, when you start from a really, really, really small number and go to just a small number, you can get some pretty impressive percentage increases. So we're now up to a whopping 1% African American population, and as we've already acknowledged, continued growth in other races and in Hispanics. Hispanics can be of any race. That's the disclaimer that you see in census data. It doesn't add up to 100. It drives sociologists crazy, but people who are of Latino or Latinx ancestry can identify as white. They can identify as black, and sometimes they identify as Latino. This is that whole thing about race. You know, they're one of the oldest Hispanic advocacy organizations is the national. They just renamed I didn't realize this. They just renamed the organization, but it was the National Conference of La Raza, and raza translates essentially as race into English from Spanish. So that's another one of those uses of the word race that's interesting, problematic, because it's used in ways that we wish sociologists wish that people wouldn't use the word in that sense. So anyway, I think what we see here is at least a little bit of the tracks of the Great Retreat even occurring in McHenry County. This period of time that African Americans are migrating into every country in every county, I keep saying country, county in every state. I just picked two random, very important examples of what was going on during that period of time after the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. Thaddeus Stevens is my hero. He was what they called a radical Republican. There were a few white people in America, not very many, but a few white people. They were housed in the Republican Party. We don't have time to explain what happened in the 20th century to realign the political parties on racial matters. I'll leave that up to others, but we don't have time for that today. And they called them the radicals. They were a fringe group. They didn't have any political power, but for a very brief moment, right after the Civil War, the audacity of the white leadership in the South in putting the people right back into office who had seceded from the Union annoyed enough Northerners who felt that this mocked their loved ones' sacrifices during the Civil War, that the radical agenda became the agenda of the Republican Party in general. This is back when President Johnson was impeached during that time. And they imposed military occupation on the states formerly in rebellion. And they had to get back into the nation, they had to have new constitutions that let black men vote. Remember, women didn't vote anywhere at that time. And they got elected. We see Hiram Revels, who briefly, until he got kicked out, was the U.S. Senator from Mississippi, of all places. Mississippi had one of the most racially diverse state legislatures for a very short period of time. And what happened after that is, again, beyond the scope of our presentation, but in that brief moment, a lot of the freed people migrated to places outside the traditional slaveholding South. That's my point. So he called Lowen calls this the Great Retreat from 1890 to about 1930 or so. He argues that, speaking of other groups, that expelling the Chinese immigrants from the West Coast was kind of he calls it a rehearsal for the expulsion of African Americans. You may not know this, but the first federal law regulating immigration was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So the first time we decided to do something as a government about immigration was to keep people out. This is an enduring theme in American history. It's not just, it's not just in the past, it's not just in the present, this is kind of it's an enduring theme. A mob of whites would come in and they'd put the Chinese population onto a train and send them to San Francisco after they'd built the Union Pacific Railroad, and thousands of them died in that process. But let's look at with regard to African Americans. This was I kind of played around with this to try to make it visually understandable. In 1890, there were no counties in Illinois where there were no black people at all, okay? In Wisconsin, there were 8, Iowa 13, Indiana, one county in Indiana that didn't have any black people at all, and 4 in Michigan. There were 6 counties that had fewer than 10, not percent, but 10 actual people. 6, 27, 28, 14, 23. 40 years later, there were 6 counties in Illinois that had no black people at all. And there were 17 that had fewer than 10. And you see the same pattern in other parts of the country. Lowen has been able to document how this took place in many parts of the Midwest. But why did this change? Why did white America just sort of roll over in bed one morning and say, well, we've got 5 black people in McHenry County, let's make them go to Chicago? No, there's something else has to be going on. And one of the things that happened, and he makes a point in his book that when you think about demographics, by 1890, most Americans hadn't been born during the Civil War. And people didn't live all that long. Mortality was high and so forth. The argument that we need to look out for the freed people because Uncle Bob lost his leg at Antietam Creek began to lose its force by the end of the 19th century. Immigrants from Europe were often in economic conflict with African Americans, and they wanted to be seen as white people in good standing, and they weren't. The discrimination against the Irish and the Italians and all of the European ethnic groups, they really weren't considered white people in good standing. But one of the ways that you could get to be white was to demonstrate how un-black you were. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, who many of you have heard of, I'm sure, commented in 1920 that sometimes the immigrants would get off the boat already infected with anti-black racism. The next thing had to do with political parties. The Democratic Party, which I swear to God was the party of white people. They had, in the 1870 election, the white man's ticket. They didn't beat around the bush. They managed to recruit immigrants, and the Republicans didn't, especially in the big cities. The Republicans were, they were, at least some of them were legitimately in favor of civil rights and so forth for African Americans, but they didn't like Catholics. They were very rural Protestant, white type, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and a lot of the immigrants were Catholic. The Republicans would campaign against Romanism and rebellion, so that just drove them into the party, the Democratic Party. So they ended up with that weird, by the middle of the 20th century, that weird coalition that the Democrats had that kept them in power for a long time of segregationist Southern whites and Northern white ethnics. Which, that has fractured in more recent years. The other thing is that there was other stuff going on. The country, we were building railroads and factories, and the population was increasing, and people wanted to just kind of get over it. There was a terrible depression in 1875, the Panic of 1875, which until what we call the Great Depression was called the Great Depression. People were out of work, and suddenly keeping federal troops in the South so that black people could vote and hold office just didn't seem to be quite that important. And then this is an argument that Lowen makes. Andrew Johnson, sorry, I was I was having a senior moment. At the end of the 19th century, we finally completely subjugated the Native American population. And the United States we flirted with imperialism for a while, Puerto Rico and Hawaii, and that gave, according Lowen suggests, that gave sort of cultural legitimacy to the idea of white people telling people of darker skin what to do. And that we knew what was best for them. It was the white man's burden, as Kipling so famously said. All right, so the Great Retreat happened, and we see that in some of that data from McHenry County. It's gradually becoming better understood that things actually got worse for African Americans toward the end of the 19th century and into the first 3 decades of the 20th. Historian Rayford Logan, in 1954, coined the phrase the nadir, and it means the word means the low point, but he called it the nadir with capital N, the low point in the treatment of African Americans, and he dated it roughly from 1900 till 1940. And then came the Great Depression and World War II and the much larger and more famous migration of African Americans to the north. In Illinois, there were 645,000 black people in 1950, over 1.4 million by 1970. But this period was characterized by new forms of white supremacist practice and documented by many social scientists. And I want to give credit to these folks. I always try to associate faces with names when I can. I've got one more slide about what did the nadir consist of. These are just some little things that characterize what was happening. We had black people playing professional baseball in the United States long before Jackie Robinson. In 1889, Moses Fleetwood Walker was released, and that was it for black people until Jackie Robinson in baseball. 1896, not in one of its better moments, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that racial segregation by law doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. 1898, funny thing happened in Wilmington, North Carolina. There were still, this was long after the Democrats had white Democrats had pretty much taken control of politics in the South, but there were still a few little places where the light of Reconstruction continued to glow. And the Republicans had a coalition of blacks and whites, and they got elected to local office in Wilmington. Well, the defeated Democrats, they got machine guns out of the National Guard armory, and they drove the elected, it was a coup d'etat. It was a legitimate coup d'etat. The Republicans appealed to President McHenry to send federal troops, and he said no. And they replaced the Republicans with Democrats. And at the same time, Wilmington was a majority black city at the time. A lot of black Wilmingtonians, I guess they'd call them, saw the handwriting on the wall and left, and the town became majority white too. But these were the kinds of things that led Rayford Logan to call this period of time the nadir. In 1901, George H. White, ironically named, lost his election to Congress, and he was the last African American in the House till 1929, and he was the last congressperson from the South till 1973. They used to have black jockeys in the Kentucky Derby. They eliminated them in 1911, and then in everybody should see Birth of a Nation. I wanted to make sure I had it in words so people didn't think I was talking about somebody named Bertha the Nation. Trust me on this. Sometimes what you say is not what the students hear. The Birth of a Nation, a landmark movie in terms of film technique. If you take a film course, you will learn about Birth of a Nation. But it's about the Ku Klux Klan, and they're the heroes. They come in and they drive those damn Yankee carpetbaggers out of the South, and it's a silent movie. The black people are played by white people in blackface. There's a virginal young white girl who's lusted after by this guy, this mixed race, and he's got his union uniform hat on and all that. And it's terrifying, actually. It was a huge hit. Woodrow Wilson liked it. Woodrow Wilson was one of the most vicious white supremacists we've ever had in the White House. It was really the White House in those days. All right, so we're into the nadir. At the same time that African Americans are moving in huge numbers into the North, one of the ways to deal with it was creating sundown towns, and sometimes by violence. In Romeoville, Illinois, there was a riot in 1893. 8 people were killed. Threat. They had the golden age of the Ku Klux Klan really was the 1920s, and not in the Deep South. In Indiana, they ran the state of Indiana for a few years. Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and in Fond du Lac, which is an area that still has a very small white population, that the so-called Holy Land, north of Lake Winnebago, Fond du Lac, Oshkosh, what else? They had a huge Klan gathering, and that encouraged black folks to leave. Ordinance. Suburbs with the word green in them almost all had some kind of legal restriction on whether people who weren't white could buy houses there. Greendale, Wisconsin was established in 1938 as a whites-only community. Maroa, Illinois, which I've driven through, as recently as 2001, this is again from Lowen, a prospective homebuyer was told, oh, there aren't any blacks in Maroa because we have a law against it. Oh, they didn't. But if people think there's a law against it, it might as well be true, the famous sociological truism. Official government action, Columbia, Illinois, 1941. The freeze, I don't have time to explain a freeze out, but it's just kind of a boycott almost of renting houses or selling to black people. Bell City, Missouri, buyout. Liberty Township, 1922, the folks got together and then used tax dollars and bought out the small black population and invited them to leave. And then the so-called sundown suburbs, a couple of famous ones are Edina, Minnesota in the 1930s, and Wilmette, Illinois as recently as 1910. I would point out that some of these towns were also restricted in terms of religion. That I tantalizingly found by accident on a Facebook page for a high school reunion in Crystal Lake, it was, you know you grew up in Crystal Lake if, right? Well, if you remember going into Lakewood, that, sort of posh enclave by the lake in Crystal Lake, and it would say Lakewood Gentiles only on the sign. And that's true. When a million years ago, I used to spray lawns for ChemLawn, and part of my area was Kenilworth, which is an extremely wealthy, tiny little suburb on the lake. And everybody was named Smith, like Johnson, Wilson. There weren't any Kazmiriks, or there weren't even any Eccles. Everybody was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So, that sort of thing. It wasn't just African Americans, but it was much more common for these sorts of restrictions to be aimed at black people. These processes were documented by a number of important people. I remember reading this book a long time ago. Arnold Hearst combined the best of both worlds. He did his research in Chicago, and he was a professor at the University of New Orleans. He wrote a book called Making the Second Ghetto. And one of the big villains in this story is my alma mater, the University of Chicago, and how they, in cahoots with the Mayor Daley the First regime, arranged to get working class African Americans out of the Hyde Park neighborhood where the university is located. But it's about things like putting the Dan Ryan Expressway where they put it to separate black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods. Running if there was going to be an urban expressway, that when they ran Interstate 10 through New Orleans, they ran it right down Claiborne Avenue, which was kind of the main street of black New Orleans. Those kinds of overt white supremacist practices. Also, with regard to racial segregation in housing, American Apartheid, which is that's a pretty bold title. This book is getting old now, and so are Massey and Denton, but also documenting the practices of the real estate industry. This book I ran across just a few years ago. Beryl Satter is an interesting person. She wrote a book about her father, who worked himself to death. He was a lawyer in Chicago, and his business was working with African Americans who had bought houses on contract. See, in those days, there were almost no black realtors, and there was no Zillow, so you couldn't find out what houses cost without going through a realtor to get the multiple listing services. Black people couldn't do that. And if you did find a house, banks wouldn't lend you any money. So what evolved was this process of essentially buying a house the way poor people buy furniture on time. But if you stop making the payments on your couch, they take it away, or your car, and then the repo man comes. Well, they would repossess your house, and you didn't have any equity in the house. And then they'd go and they'd sell it to somebody else on contract for more money. Satter argues, she didn't know her dad. He died when she was a small child. She found out all this stuff as an adult, wrote this book about race, real estate, and exploitation of black urban America. And she concludes that millions and millions of dollars of potential wealth, which is where most Americans get their wealth, is from housing, was extracted from the black community in Chicago between 1940 and 1970. One of the tactics that was followed that had racial consequences is the practice of redlining, of not making housing loans in certain areas based on, it was kind of a catch-22, the undesirable neighborhoods. Well, one of the criteria for making a neighborhood undesirable was having a lot of black people in it. So you couldn't get a VA or FHA loan. And you think of all of the people in the United States in the 50s and 60s, like my parents, like my in-laws, who bought a little house somewhere. My in-laws bought in Carpentersville and Meadowdale. My folks bought in Pimmit Hills near Washington, D.C., and they'd build equity and roll it over and get a bigger house and so forth, maybe pass some of that money on to their kids, help us with our down payment on our first house in 1985. This eliminated that American dream for people of color, but especially for people of African American ancestry. Speaking of sundown suburbs, Country Club Edition, which is the official name for Lakewood, and somewhere around 1950, this was in the housing deed. The ownership and occupancy of lots and buildings in these editions are forever restricted to members of the pure white race. No Negro, mulatto, Chinese, Japanese, or person of any race or mixture of races other than a person of pure white race shall acquire title to any lot or building in these editions or acquire the right to occupy any such lot or building. Lowen argues that every, and we don't use the word every very much in social sciences, we'll say predominantly or something like that. Every single developer suburban development before 1970 was restricted. And so that probably Coventry, where I lived as a child, had that. We sure didn't have any black people. And former Crystal Lake history teacher, he actually emailed Lowen, I know who this is, it's probably Craig Foncook, said that he had it in his deed as late as 1971. And I was teaching a class talking about this phenomenon. One of my students, an older guy, I live in Wonder Lake, and I bought my house off this old Polish lady, and when we were buying, she brought out the deed, and it had a restrictive covenant in it. These were struck down by the Supreme Court in 1948, but that didn't stop people from putting them into the property deeds. Just because the Supreme Court isn't the police. They're an appellate court. They don't have enforcement. Anyway. Realtors don't come off well in this story. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing, anyway, you can see that it was against the realtor code of ethics to put black people in white neighborhoods. So, some of you are thinking, wait, didn't we make all this stuff illegal back in 1968? Yes, we did. In April 11th, when the National Guard was had a cordon around the Congress. A coalition of northern liberal Republicans and Democrats, and some mostly Northerners, but not all Republicans and Democrats, had been unable to defeat conservative Northern Republicans and white supremacist Southern Democrats in getting Fair Housing Act through. Well, Washington's on fire, right, from the riots after Dr. King was assassinated, and the Congress got, maybe we should do something about open housing. So they passed it, but in order to get it passed, they still had to make it basically unenforceable. They didn't appropriate money for enforcement, and we've never really done a good job of enforcing the Fair Housing Act. And as I was putting this together, I'm reading the paper, holy crap, new book, and I have to read this book. Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who's a professor of African American Studies at Princeton, has this new book, Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership. Apparently things got even worse in during the collapse of the real estate market in '06. Blacks who could have qualified for less expensive regular mortgages were given the subprime mortgage. It's just, all this stuff is still going on. So what's to be done? Well, we could enforce the law. I didn't turn off my own phone. That's shame on me. All right, I'm going to have to just leave that one. Sorry, that's terrible. That's never happened to me before. Now I've started to really carry my phone everywhere, and now I'm going to have to move into the 21st century. There's an interesting technique. It's called Audit Teams, where you have people pose as home shoppers, and they'll have like a couple, and they'll have a black couple and a white couple, and they'll have exactly the same fictitious credit rating and jobs and all that stuff, and every time we do those audit teams, we find racial discrimination. It's just every single time, and this has been going on for years. To do this with some teeth behind it and put some people in jail for discriminating in housing, but that is not happening. Encourage your community to affirm that it has open housing. Run for the city council and see if you can get a declaration. There have been some places that will do that. Whereas this, where we renounce discrimination in housing. Vote. Vote for people who want to fight housing discrimination and segregation by race, ethnicity, and class. In your workplace, and we've been learning, to try not to do this, but we probably still do it, even at MCC. Oh, I don't know whether Latavius is going to be comfortable around here. Where is he going to get his hair cut, and so forth. Those are the sorts of soft discriminatory practices that perpetuate racial segregation in housing. And don't discriminate yourself. Now, as we're running toward the end here, I want to just raise a couple of little questions. What we're really excited about in the social sciences these days is what I would call challenges to the black-white paradigm. A lot of our theorizing and research on race focuses on blacks and whites. But we are in a country with a very large Latinx minority. Immigration from Mexico is mostly over, which is kind of ironic, that considering building the wall and so forth. For at least the last 10 or 15 years, as many people have been going from the U.S. to Mexico as the other way around. And we're seeing many signs of the same sort of what they call straight line assimilation that we saw with Eastern and Southern European immigrants. English becoming the first language spoken at home, intermarriage with people of other ethnic backgrounds. What's going to happen to the Latino population? Will they become, quote unquote, honorary whites? There was some talk about that, and maybe more recent developments would tell us that that's a privilege that can be withdrawn by white America. Will the Latino population follow the same path, or will it split into different paths based on skin color? Well, dark-skinned people of Puerto Rican ancestry have a different history than light-skinned Latinos of Cuban ancestry, for example. People of Asian descent are poised to become the largest recent immigrant population during this century. I'll show you some statistics or projections for 2065 in a minute. Will they become honorary whites? And of course, people of Asian descent are very different kinds of people. Will the story of immigrants from South Asia be the same as the story of immigrants from Vietnam, and so on? And this is the part that really gets us all excited. There are more people coming to the United States from Africa, specifically, than at any time since the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade. And also from what we call the African diaspora, places where, because of colonialism, that there's a large population of people with African ancestry. People coming from Jamaica, people coming from Curacao, people coming from Trinidad, and so forth, and from Africa. What is that going to mean to be, is that going to change what it means to be black? Will people from Trinidad identify with African Americans descended from slaves? Will they have the option of not identifying? Or will they get put into that bag? And there are people doing research on this as we speak. Will there be such a thing as third-generation Trinidadian Americans? And then finally, what about will the fault line be in America? It'll be whites versus everybody else, which is kind of the way it's been. Could it end up being blacks versus everybody else? Or is it going to be something in between? Are we going to all be miscegenated? I don't know how many of you have seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, but there's a great scene where these boys is miscegenated, which means mixed race. Are we going to end up miscegenated? So this is my last slide. No racial and ethnic group will be a majority. Kind of take a minute to digest this. In 2015, 62% of the population was white, 18% Hispanic, 12% black, 6% Asian. By 2065, now I'm going to be dead, but I hope pretty much all of y'all are going to be still alive. White people will be a minority. The Hispanic population will increase, black population about the same. The Asian ancestry population will double. And the foreign-born population, because of the decline in immigration from Spanish-speaking countries, will be more Asian than Hispanic. And that third line reminds us that there are still people immigrating to this country who are white. In closing, getting back to McHenry County, we're seeing a lot of this reflected here. There have been waves of immigration from Eastern Europe. For a while, it was I'd have people coming in from Poland. It was enough to sustain a really nice Polish deli, Truszkowski's of blessed memory in McHenry. More recent years, people coming from Lithuania. I learned how to pronounce Lithuanian names, where the ending on the last name is different, whether you're a man or a woman. It's like in Russia, if you're Romanov, Ivan Romanov marries Irina, and she's Irina Romanovna, or Romanova, I guess. And it's more complicated in Lithuanian, but so that the Lithuanian population, and we'll see how that works out. In closing, we look at what happens in suburbia in general and how that might impact the racial and ethnic mix of the county. What happens if gasoline goes to $10 a gallon? What happens if we all switch to self-driving electric cars run by wind power? What happens when we pump out all the groundwater from the aquifer? What if today's young adults who marry very late, if at all, don't like cars, think split-level houses are lame, will they abandon suburbia for cities and gentrified suburbs? We might be left with old white people like me living on a pension being attended to by a low-wage immigrant population. We just don't know, and it's going to be interesting to see how this all turns out. But you'll be there to see it, and hopefully this your education at MCC will help you, give you sort of the intellectual tools to figure out what's going on. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for having me here today. Thank you.